Hello, everyone. I'm Anna Rose. I'm the Exhibitions and Programming Associate at the Wende. Thanks so much for joining us today for our 15th talk in the Cold War Spaces series. Today, we're welcoming our guest, Aniko Imre, on the topic of spaces of television, between propaganda and consumerism. She's professor of cinematic arts in the Division of Cinema and Media Studies at the University of Southern California. And she's the author of the books TV Socialism and Identity Games, Globalization and the Transformation of Post-Communist Media Cultures. Today's program will be about a 30-minute conversation between Aniko and Joes Segal, the Wende's Chief Curator and Director of Programming. After that, there'll be about 15 minutes for a Q&A, so please get your questions ready to put in the Q&A box during that time. We appreciate all the questions we receive, but we please ask that you keep them short and concise. We also have the chat function open, so if you have any comments that aren't necessarily questions, please type that in, and everyone else, the panelists and attendees, can see that. As we're getting started, feel free to say hi in the chat, and it might be nice if you say what city you're tuning in from. We'll be posting the recording of today's program on our Vimeo page, so afterwards you can share it or go back and view our previous programs. Lastly, I'd like to thank Susan Horowitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting the discussion series at the Wende and our virtual programs. Now, Joes will get us started with the interview.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna Rose. Communist television is often considered a perfect example of political propaganda. Today, we are going to discuss some other aspects of the story. Apart from political messaging, what was the role of entertainment in commercials? How was East Bloc television connected to West European programming? What potential did communist television have for humor, irony, and subversion? But also, what are the continuities and discontinuities in television culture before and after the Cold War? And what can the story of communist TV teach us about our current polarized media landscape with its lacking consensus about the borders between news and propaganda or fake news? Aniko, welcome to Cold War Spaces.
Thank you. I'm really pleased to be part of this series.
Thanks. And I guess we have a very ambitious agenda for the coming 30 minutes, but let's see how far we get. So first of all, television did exist before the Cold War, but it only became a central medium of information and entertainment after the Second World War. So I would like to start with a very broad question. On what levels would you say that the rise of television impacted life during the Cold War?
Let me summarize that. It is a very broad question.
Right.
So you are quite right that television technology had existed in the interwar period, so before the Cold War and before Second World War, but it didn't really have a well-defined purpose. It wasn't clear how it was going to develop or whether it was going to develop into a mass medium. And then after the devastation of the war, broadcasting restarted all over Europe, in much of the world, but it did not really launch as a national broadcasting system until the mid to late 50s. So I would have to say that in terms of Eastern European or socialist internal definitions of the Cold War, it is really a post-Cold War medium. Because the Cold War, the most repressive, the most authoritarian, the most harsh dictatorial period of the Cold War had ended with the death of Stalin. And
1953.
1953 and the 1956 revolution in Hungary.
Right.
Then followed about a decade later, by 1968, the events in Prague, which ushered in a very different phase of the Cold War that's technically not considered the same phase. It was so different. It's referred to variously as the consolidation period, the normalization period, the so much softer dictatorship, or not even dictatorship, but authoritarianism, where television in this post-Cold War, so by global definition, still, of course, Cold War period, was a perfect medium for this period of consolidation, because television was a home-based medium, it was intimate, it allowed viewers some choices, some safety valve to take a break from their conditions and entertain and lean into entertainment and leisure to the extent allowed, because programming was of course limited and somewhat controlled. And it also allowed the regime to allow citizens some breathing time and breathing room. So in essence, I think, when it comes to the basic operation of TV, it really wasn't that different from the way it operated elsewhere.
Right. You were saying that television was somewhat controlled, which might be contrary to what many people think about communist television being this very strict tool of propaganda. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, and also maybe say something about the possibilities for viewers to add their agency to what programs are available?
Yeah, this is a really good question. And this is where the enormous amount of work that has come up, that has been published recently about television, socialist television, has really begun to change our entire view of the Cold War. Because I think even to this day, if you asked people who remember the Cold War, what they associate with socialist or communist television, they would say propaganda and censorship. Mm-hmm. And this is not entirely wrong. All socialist broadcasting institutions had departments that had propaganda in their names, typically agitprop, agitation propaganda. But it wasn't necessarily a kind of nefarious, fake news, deceptive kind of messaging organization. It was simply a way to put forward, to foreground and acknowledge the ideological principles of the system, which permeated all institutions and also broadcasting institutions. It wasn't really a bad thing to know what you're up against as a viewer.
Right.
Yeah. So, and I would also say that this propaganda in this sense is just the most explicit type of propaganda. It's not like Western or American broadcast institutions were devoid of propaganda. It was just not foregrounded. But the principles of the system, individualism, market-driven democracies, etc., were also embedded in the structure of television and all media institutions. They were just not explicitly acknowledged. Also, censorship, which we assume was, of course, controlling all socialist institutions, was actually not universal at all. Mm-hmm. It varied from country to country to its complete absence. In countries such as Yugoslavia, it's almost complete absence in Hungary, where of course there was authorities still paid attention to television, but left the programming to the professionals. So there
That's
were
interesting.
Yeah.
Yes. No, I was actually also wondering, because it's interesting to hear about the regional and national differences in programming. And I was wondering, was there also an element of national identity, national pride involved in the choice of programs?
That's a really good question. So I think that nationalism as a common virtue, as a common value, was actually ingrained in the foundations of television. Not just under socialism, but elsewhere. It is one of the principles of public service broadcasting, which socialist televisions pretty much adopted and emulated in a modified format. So the fostering, the facilitation of national culture, national language, national histories, identities was part of the remit of public broadcasting educations, going back to the BBC, which serves as the model. And nationalism was a principle at the level of programming, quite obviously when it came to sports competitions, but also fictional programming, historical adventure shows, lots of historical dramas, teleplays. It allowed the regime to spin historical narratives that work to its advantage by highlighting folk heroes, national heroism, which actually aligned with the needs of viewers who were looking for utopian or at least aspirational role models. So nationalism was a kind of a space of common interest between the party leadership and viewers. And I think this is why it has become probably the most enduring legacies of socialist television.
That's interesting, because you would assume that nationalism as an ideology is at odds with socialism or communism. So were there tensions between those two principles behind programming?
Between
Between
nationalism.
nationalism and communism, which is an international ideology.
Yes, of course you're right that socialist countries or communist countries, depending on
Yeah.
the jury is out there, which one we prefer to use, but
Right,
talking
right.
about the same thing, were involved in an alliance of socialist or communist internationalism. But internationalism implies the pre-existence of national cultures, national countries. So these countries engaged as national units in a kind of friendly, competitive alignment, which worked out in international meetings, joint broadcasting, various types of friendly collaboration. So I don't think there is a contradiction between the two.
No, I understand. Okay. So one of the things that struck me in your work is the role of commercials in socialist or communist television. That sounds very counterintuitive. Why were there commercials in a communist setting, and what was their role?
That is an interesting question, and I was struck by that and struggled to explain it, even as someone who lived through this period of late socialism, the 70s and the 80s. Why were there commercials? Isn't the very existence of commercials contradictory to a socialist ideology? It's an oxymoron.
Right.
However, and commercials did exist, marketing institutions for the most part, and we have to emphasize vast regional differences among the countries. So I'm giving you generalizations that might not apply the same way in Albania as they apply in Poland. But marketing departments said that there was a very well-developed culture of advertising and marketing before World War II, which didn't disappear, which continued in radio. The institution onto which the institution of television broadcasting was built. And commercials existed pretty much from the beginning. They resembled, they advertised the system. They really advertised the system. They assisted central planning. They called attention to products and services that needed some attention. They had an orienting function. They encouraged viewers to become consumers in the consumers of the products and services provided by the state. So they had a kind of informational, some of them had a kind of PSA function, public service announcement function.
Right.
They were friendly guiding institutions, although some commercials were produced for foreign advertising as well. Yugoslavia had the most developed advertising department, actually had a contract with RAI, with the Italian broadcaster.
Right.
And some argue that this engagement, this advertising to Italian audiences was actually more capitalist than Italy or public broadcasters in the West were at the time. But Hungary had a marketing department, marketing public relations or proto-public relations department that actually provided a significant amount of revenue to an institution that was suffering in the absence and the increasing scarcity of state funding. So, and this was not a part of the story that was much talked about, but the commercial funding, the self-generation of revenue by these semi-commercial branches of socialist television, as in Hungary, were actually a really important part of the hybridization of the system, the economic hybridization of a state-funded system that was also a somewhat capitalist system by the 80s.
That's very interesting also, that this was a process we don't know that much about, generally speaking. Another very interesting point, I think, is that when you speak about the Cold War and think in terms of the Iron Curtain neatly dividing East and West, there are so many things that actually connected both halves of Europe, and one of them was television signals, which didn't stop by any conceived border. So, for instance, East Germans could watch West German television, and of course vice versa. Czechs could, or Czechoslovaks could view Hungarian television and Austrian programs. In Yugoslavia, it was possible to receive Italian signals, as it was in Albania. Estonians watched Finnish television, etc. Could you say something about the impact of people being able to receive West European programs in their own country, in Eastern Europe?
You're quite right about signal sharing and the inability of regimes to control signal sharing. The jamming mechanisms were simply ineffective.
Right.
We don't know that much about the impact. So from the point of view of impact, it's very hard to measure this phenomenon. I mean, obviously it was impactful, but the impact didn't always go the way the regimes intended. It's, you know, the ethnographic studies were virtually non-existent. Audience measurement, although it did exist, was often guided by socialist principles and not reliable. So it's really hard to track. And socialist memories of socialist citizens are, of course, unreliable. So I don't know if I can speculate too much on the impact. I can talk about the intended impact. Or counter impact or counter intentions. So these signal sharing phenomena were actually, as you said, quite widespread. I mean, most notoriously in Germany, not just in the divided city of Berlin, but in all of East Germany, with the exception of the area near Dresden, where the valley of the clueless, where the signals didn't share. All East German citizens were able to access West German broadcasting, which was often produced and targeted towards them. So there was a kind of broadcast war between the East German and West German institutions to counter program, to schedule programming, similar types of programming at the same time, where of course West Germany won out to the extent that Erich Honecker gave up on the war, just conceded. Gave up on any kind of control. But even in countries like Albania, where it was virtually impossible to limit access to Italian broadcasting, Enver Hoxha imagined, and his party imagined
the Albanian leader, yeah.
Yes, in the early 70s, they gave unlimited access. They didn't even try to jam the signals for a short period, thinking that the exposure to decadent Western lifestyles would naturally put off Albanian citizens, which predictably did not happen.
That's also interesting, because some of those decadent programs like Peyton Place, Dallas Dynasty, etc., were actually bought by some East European countries to be screened on their national television, right?
Well, don't even get me started on Dallas. I mean, Dallas, I think to me, the most interesting anecdote, true story about Dallas is that in the 80s of Ceausescu, in the last years when populations were starving and electricity was limited to a couple hours a day, so broadcasting was very limited, and much of it was taken up by, programs about the dictator and his wife, Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu. Dallas was still on, in a kind of censored and curtailed version, but people could still watch that. To this day, there is a cult of Dallas, a kind of post-socialist nostalgia for Dallas in Romania. But even you mentioned Finland. So in Estonia, there was a weekend tourism, television tourism, whereby people from other parts of Estonia would travel to the border areas to be able to follow their favorite soap operas, including Dallas. These are really, really fascinating stories.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. Which brings me to another question. In how far would you say was it possible, and maybe specifically in the later years of the Cold War, for television makers to add humor and irony, or even be a little politically subversive on television?
Yeah, so you could never eradicate humor from television, being a medium of entertainment, which party authorities were never quite able to understand and control. As we said at the beginning, by the time television became a mass medium, it slipped out of control. Parties never quite understood how it worked and how they could turn it in the service of their own ideological purposes. So humor persisted. More explicitly, again, there is a great deal of regional variety, but the tradition of political cabaret from the early 20th century very much survived on radio and on TV, especially in Czechoslovakia, Poland, Germany, and Hungary. And by the post-Cold War, late Cold War era of the 1970s and 80s, comic programming in the form of variety shows, skits, etc., humorous programs was really a staple and one of the most popular and most in-demand kind of programming. And I think it provided a kind of valve, safety valve, for populations to feel like they are not crazy. They are. There is some dialogue about the condition, about the discrepancy between the ideals that they are still expected to adhere to and the daily conditions in which they are living. And comedy bridged that. It highlighted corruption, it highlighted the deficiencies of the system.
And there was no censorship to stop that?
So that's interesting. And I think and this is also documented by many excellent colleagues who have written about this, there was no censorship to stop that for the most part, because it was also in the regime's interest to allow this kind of breathing room, to masquerade as a system that is actually open to a plurality of views. And it's not as authoritarian or illiberal as it seems. So again, humor, while it was subversive, while it was critical, was a way of perpetuating the regime. It strengthened the status quo in terms of an ideological agreement during the thaw between party authorities and viewers.
Right, I understand. So speaking about the last years of the Cold War, of course, after the Berlin Wall came down and the velvet and not so velvet revolutions all over the place, there was a radical impact on television culture, moving from a communist to a capitalist system. Can you sketch out a little bit what the impact was for television? And also, I think very strikingly, you read about current infringements of press freedom in countries like Poland and Hungary with their right-wing populist governments. Would you say that the kind of control of television programs nowadays in those countries is somehow comparable to the Cold War period, or is it completely different?
Big question again. It is somewhat different and somewhat similar. So after the Cold War ended, there was a scramble for ownership. There were often quite vicious fights for kind of mapping out the new media landscape in terms of regulation, in terms of ownership. Of course, international corporations, transnational corporations discovered Eastern Europe as a new market. And there was a moment of optimism for a more democratic system. And that came to a kind of screeching halt by the end of the 90s, when oligarchic networks started forming around party leaders who increasingly consolidated their power in a way that's not dissimilar to late socialist long-term autocrats. Mm-hmm. So even though technically there is freedom of the press, there's, it's a capitalist system, I think we can more accurately describe these media systems as versions of a kind of neoliberal authoritarianism, where much of the media, and again, there are some differences, but in general, I think we can talk about a trend in Eastern Europe towards more like a Berlusconi type kind of ownership structure, where these oligarchic networks not only bought up media, not just television, but also newspapers and internet sites, but also controlled them ideologically around this combination, this curiously effective combination of neoliberal authoritarianism. So the authoritarian tendencies and structures very much borrow from and resemble late socialism, but it's coupled with the pretense or the appearance of market freedom and unlimited capitalist environment.
Okay, yeah, so maybe that's can lead me to my last question before we open it up for Q&A. And that is, I mentioned in the introduction the radically polarized television or media landscape now in the United States, where, say, Fox News and CNN struggle not only about the interpretation of facts, but even the character of facts. So there is no consensus anymore, you could say, between what is real and what is fake. Does that remind you in any way of political propaganda in the Cold War era in the communist countries, or is this a completely new situation?
Yes and no.
Yeah.
So I think, and this is where we can really learn a lot from revisiting that era. That was the era of before the internet revolution, before cable, before the VCR, before satellite, before the widespread availability of different news sources and different media outlets. So it was a very, very different era when most viewers, certainly in Eastern Europe, only had one or later on two channels which were controlled. Maybe they listened to Voice of America, but otherwise there was not much competition. However, the distrust in communist institutions nurtured a trust in something else. So it was kind of a binary system where you trust something and you distrust something to the extent that you trust something else that you don't quite know, but you know it's out there. It's associated with democracy, it's associated with maybe with liberalism, with the market. This belief, this investment in something you can trust, of course, did not pan out after the Cold War. And again, because the media landscape has changed as a result of globalization and political changes, because of very legitimate disappointment with the European Union and with the system of capitalism as a whole. So, however, the structure of this binary structure of trusting something and a balanced investment in something you want to trust, I think is probably the most impactful legacy of communism. I think this is why when we wonder how come we have authoritarian countries 30 years after authoritarianism ended to widespread euphoria, I think this is my speculation. It's not the content of propaganda, it's the structure of propaganda that really prevailed. We live in a very different environment where we can't trust anymore. And it's all the more imperative that people, viewers, put their trust in something. And these bubbles, you know, there's a lot of speculation on how these form. These bubbles of trust that form around certain political views of the world, alternative realities for the most part, are very coherent.
Right. So do you see a way out? Do you see a way how to reconnect?
I want to believe in a way out. I mean, it's not going to be a way out. It's not going to be a way back. I think we can learn from lessons, but I think there is I want to believe that after the interruption of COVID and the growing distrust in globalization, the degree to which people are fed up with not being able to trust, not able to trust in capitalism and neoliberalism is gathering momentum. And I think the racial justice movements are also a sign of this. So I do want to believe that there is a growing and perhaps global consensus that is going to result in a different view of reality that will lead to rebuilding after all the destruction that we'll be left with.
Well, I share your hope wholeheartedly.
One has to hope.
Let's go to the Q&A, and there are already a few questions, so please type your questions in the Q&A box. Sharam Asmoude asks, any specific papers or essays that one can read on Dallas in Romania?
Well, I think you have more to say about this, because the Wende had a wonderful program around Dallas in Romania. I don't remember the name of the filmmaker or the film, but this independent filmmaker who made a film about Dallas nostalgia, the Dallas Hotel.
Right,
Romania.
Dallas Hotel, yeah.
I don't know is that what it's called, the Dallas Hotel?
Yeah.
So that would be a great resource. Let me say, I don't know about specific articles, but there are quite a few books that might contain some. Actually, I do remember an article, but would you mind emailing me, because I do have something in mind, but I can't recall the exact title and name of the. I know the book, but I can.
Okay.
Your source.
That's very generous. We'll solve that through individual email, yeah.
Sure.
Esther Elliott asks, what type of programs were popular and why?
So the most popular programs universally were sports, popular music, comedy, quiz and game shows, and fictional programs, so dramatic programs. So what all these have in common is that they provided entertainment. And so, because people could tune out and in, they could turn off the TV. They were very clear on their choice. You asked about consumer agency earlier, and they had agency, unlike in the course of their participation in other aspects of socialist life. They didn't need to perform in public. They could privately tune out. And it was very clear that viewers demanded these programs. This is what led to a need for imports for dramatic series from Western Europe and from the United States, that people wanted to see entertainment programming that domestic productions simply could not supply.
Right. Okay, thanks. Another question is from Bruce Hollihan. He writes, living in the USA, one can get relatively easy access to the cinema of the lands on the other side of the Iron Curtain. However, access to television from this era is not so available. To date, I've only seen a few episodes of Polizeiruf 110 and Treffpunkt Flughafen from the GDR. Because I find that countries such as Poland and Hungary have very sophisticated traditions in drama, which can be seen in movies, I'm especially interested in seeing more, but television programs. I only am aware of children's programs from this era, like Poland's Miss Usatek, the floppy-eared bear. Could you make some recommendations for good television programs from that era, please?
I can make recommendations, but you're quite right that the issue of access is severe, because most of these programs only exist in their original languages. They're not subtitled, and they are not widely available on the internet. If you might need to travel to these countries and dip into the archives, if they are even available, because that's also a political issue. The European Union has several initiatives for digitizing archives and making them available. So that would be a way to go. Euroscreen, the initiative is called Euroscreen. They have very extensive archives. Otherwise it's just enthusiastic devotees of European television that share programs on the internet, mostly on YouTube. I think I would recommend YouTube for finding these. You are also right that children's televisions traveled freely, mostly because they were devoid of dialogue. So for instance, Curator, that I know the Wende is going to show.
The little mole, yeah.
The story of the little mole, to this day, extremely popular, not just in Eastern Europe, but also in Japan, in Scandinavia. It really had a life of export at the time and an afterlife to this day. So if you're interested in children's television, I think that might be easier to access. But like good programs, you know, there was a great deal of fandom around the Czechoslovak. I call them socialist soap operas because that's what they were. And if you allow me to share my screen just for a second, just to highlight some of these, since you asked for recommendations. So the first one here is some of the most memorable ones is the 30 Cases of Major Zeman, 1970s show. Most of these were produced by Jaroslav Didl, who was a creator, kind of a showrunner before his time, before showrunners were called showrunners. It was a propaganda program bundled in a soap opera format. So it follows the life of Major Zeman, who is an upstanding citizen, always makes the right choices, demonstrates collective values, also devoted to his family, and the show follows each year of his life. Or Women Behind the Counter, which was supposed to highlight socialist lifestyle after socialist regimes quite obviously lost out in the economic competition against the capitalist system. The emphasis shifted to the superiority of socialist lifestyles, of security and abundance. As you can see, Anna works behind the counter that is really well stocked in a way that's quite utopian, as soap operas tend to be, full of luxury products, caviar and exotic fruit. And again, she's a socialist woman who shows us a great example of how to function as a mother, as part of a socialist work collective, and as a partner. Or just one more, probably the most popular one that also inspired Schwarzwald Clinic, for those of you who remember Schwarzwald Clinic. Another Jaroslav production, The Hospital at the Edge of Town, which was supposed to boost the perception of the socialist healthcare system, a hospital that's full of dedicated doctors who are extremely patient, who devote all their energies to single patients. And of course, there is lots of drama in their lives. So this was very much a hospital soap. I recommend these wholeheartedly. And even though in some ways they are dated, they're also quaint and sweet and historical documents of the 1970s.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So lots of new questions right now. Laurel Day writes, thank you so much for doing this, Aniko. Until COVID hit Toronto, I was researching films and TV programs that originally belonged to the Polish consulate in Toronto. While most of the films had the nationalistic historic imagery you referenced earlier, I also found some films made by directors during martial law. Is this common in your research of overseas communist embassy programming?
I have not researched overseas communist embassy programming, so kind of like television diplomacy, I think is what you mean. But it's a fascinating area of research. I would love for you to do this. Yeah, and especially during specific periods such as martial law, when television was pretty much put on hold because electricity was rationed. Right. You know, my research is one of the first kind of mapping exercises, and it's not the only one. But I think we are at the stage of mapping socialist television when we can explore more specific areas, and this is certainly all yours. I would love to see the results of this research.
Great, thank you. Asher Goodhertz writes, are there any striking examples of adaptations of Western television shows on socialist television?
I assume you mean fictional shows. Mm-hmm. And you know, so one of the fascinating aspects of socialist television, or the history of television that includes socialist television, is the amount of circulation, cooperation, as well as unacknowledged borrowing. So this is a time when, before formats were codified, when television executives might see a program on a trip to, I don't know, Belgium or the United States, and come back and say, let's do something like that. So program types, loosely considered genres, very much circulated in the Eastern Bloc as well. You would have, for instance, the show I just mentioned, the 30 years of Major Zeman, was colloquially called the Czechoslovak Bond, because it was, even though, obviously Zeman has nothing to do with the glamour of James Bond, it was a similar kind of show that included spy elements and international adventure. So for instance, spy shows were produced based on these loosely circulating formulas, historical adventure shows, and they followed the same wave, so they were popular worldwide at the same time. This was also true for quiz and game shows, which popped up, very similar types of game shows popped up all over the world. And again, the history of socialist TV is very much a part of this.
Yeah, very interesting. Paul Lerner writes, thanks for this very enjoyable discussion. You alluded to audience research, which in the US was pioneered to a great extent by emigres from Central Europe, Austria above all. Can you say more about audience research in Eastern Bloc countries, about methods, key figures, places where it was most developed?
Yeah, so there are a couple of hubs of audience research that focuses on East European television. As I said this, it's not easy to do. Audience research did exist during socialism, during the Cold War, in media sociology departments. And, the records of this are mostly unexplored. So for instance, in Hungary, Elemér Hankis, Hankiss, was a central figure of media sociology. He was later the president of television for a few years after the end of socialism. In Prague at Charles University, Irena Rajfová has conducted audience research based on surveys and based on interviews, memories of socialist audiences. So I would recommend her. So Irena Rajfová. And yeah, this is a difficult, arduous kind of work, because you have to have, professional expertise in conducting ethnographies, but you also need to have very significant knowledge of the historical circumstances that allow you to translate, to interpret the expressed memories of viewers in a way that's useful for us to get us a picture of contemporaneous conditions.
Right, thanks. Yeah. Then Dan Rookman has a question. What role did television play, and did that role evolve over time in seminal events like the Potsdam riots, the Hungarian Revolution, Prague Spring, etc., either or both as a tool of the government or as a tool of the dissidents?
Yeah, so there's quite a bit of research about these events as well. I would like to know about how Hungarian television covered the 56 revolution. My impression is it did not. Television was launched as a broadcast institution during the revolution. And to my knowledge, there was no coverage of these extremely consequential and violent historical events going on in the street at the same time. Now, again, television was only available to a couple thousand viewers at the time. It was not a mass institution, but the programming was entirely disconnected from political events. And I assume, I haven't looked into this recently, but I assume that the coverage of these events, especially events that threatened the system's legitimacy, was extremely filtered and censored in later times as well.
Well, of course, there's the famous story of the live television broadcasts of the Romanian Revolution, which was then another story.
Yeah, so that was another story. By then, television, so 56 and 60, it could be controlled. 89 could not be easily controlled. Ceausescu lost it in front of a manufactured crowd, and then the revolutionaries quite rightly, quite smartly took over the television. And then when the wall came down, perhaps some of us still remember those images, a bunch of networks covered the events. It was a live revolution. CNN, of course, by then had been established as the 24-hour news network. All three US networks were there. And also, and there are books about this as well, the story was generated, the narrative of the not just the revolution, but the entire history of socialism was generated by these accounts on both sides, both network anchors, reporters, and the interviewees in the street confirmed that the socialist experiment failed, and the socialist populations are quite happy, ecstatic to move back into or on to the democracy of all kinds of freedoms. And that was, of course, necessary, but also detrimental to how we evaluate the Cold War, which are now at the cusp of reevaluation.
Right, right. So it is 1:45, but I'm going to give us a few extra minutes, if that is okay, because there are still a few very interesting questions. Let me see. Esther Timani writes, thank you so much for this. Thank you so much for this amazing discussion. You mentioned that accessing these TV shows in archives is itself political and subject to challenges. In your opinion, as far-right nationalist parties continue to consolidate their power throughout the region, revising history in the process, is there a risk of these TV shows being lost, either by disappearing from or simply being allowed to degrade in neglected archives?
Yes. So television, because it has always been kind of a debased and reviled medium, for many reasons, but because it's been considered popular, it has always been compared to the treasures of national high culture, literature, film, classical music, etc. It has also not been preserved. I mean, television was live for a long time, but even after it started being recorded, it was not well preserved. During the Cold War and after '89, many television professionals, many of whom lost their jobs, took some of these recordings home. So the archive kind of spread to people's garages and basements, and it's virtually impossible to piece them together. What's in the archives, the archives, of course, have been recently working on digitizing and preserving the remaining materials. But that has also been under a bit of an ideological pressure depending on the countries. In a country like Hungary, it's been under a great deal of pressure. Digitization has been controlled and halted for a while. And I myself have not been able to physically make it into the archive or successfully negotiate more than transcripts of shows. I am beholden to the heroic work of former trivia professionals, and let me just mention one, just a towering person, Péter Dunavölgyi, who recently passed away, unfortunately, who is single-handedly wrote up the history of Hungarian television based on his access as a former archivist and television professional. So it often comes to finding the kind of back doors to these archives and the works of people who still have access rather than the official routes. I mean, right. Hopefully this situation will change because, scholarship needs the material. But that's the short answer to Esther's question.
Right, okay, thank you. I'm going to ask you to give even shorter questions to the few remaining, or shorter answers to the few remaining questions because we're over time. But I just want to mention a few. Donna Stein asks, how important were children's programs for indoctrination?
Short answer.
Yeah, answer.
I mean, everything that television produced was an instrument of indoctrination, but often indoctrination was not in the service of supporting socialist values or Marxism, Leninism, but basically education and elevation, the erudition of the socialist citizen. So there were certain basic fundamental values inscribed into these shows, such as collectivism, the attention to the connections between the individual and the community, self-improvement, some very familiar and very contemporary values. So I wouldn't even call it indoctrination. So those values were, of course, fueling and motivating the production of children's programming, but, you know, again, not more than you would see in an American children's show produced by the Disney Channel. I mean, I think Disney has produced much more explicit indoctrination in its programming. And I'm not judging, I'm not casting any judgment. Yeah, that's my short answer.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, one final question, and I have to apologize for not being able to address all the questions. Nitin Govil, thank you for this enlivening discussion. You often speak of the role of memory in your research. How do you research media memory, and what approaches have you found to be the most useful in your work?
A theoretical question at the end.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really hard to research memory in relation to television, because television is both, you know, a tool of amnesia and forgetting and repetition and recycling, and a very much a historical medium that is charged with preserving history. So, you know, it's crucially important to examine television with these caveats in mind, that it has a particular way of producing memory that is prone to repetition and nostalgia. And you have to be very aware of the kinds of filters that go into reproducing television memory by virtue of the way in which the medium is produced. And that way of production then becomes instrumental or crucial to examine, you know, so the industrial nature of the medium and the way in which it's distributed is crucial to examining memory. In this way, I don't think socialist television memory methods of examining socialist television memory are crucially different from, and we can very much rely on the amazing amount of research on television and memory that has been produced in television studies.
Great. Aniko, I want to thank you very, very much for this fascinating and extremely lively presentation.
My
pleasure. It was a great pleasure to have you. Thank you.
Always.
Yeah.
Thank you, Joes. Thanks.
Sure. And next week, my guest is Julia Tatiana Bailey, art historian. She's the curator of modern and contemporary art at the National Gallery in Prague, and the founder of the Espionart blog. And under the title Exhibition Space, Art as Diplomacy Across the Cold War Divide, we will speak about the art sections of the Soviet-American exchange exhibitions and their intricate cultural and political backstories. So I hope to see you then. Have a wonderful week. Bye-bye.